This is the Daytona International Speedway in Florida.
By the late 1960s, NASCAR's rulebook was getting thicker every season. New measurements were added. Inspection procedures became more detailed. To most fans, it looked like the natural evolution of a growing sport. People inside the garage knew better. For years, NASCAR officials had been fighting a battle against one of the most inventive minds in American motorsports. Every time they closed a loophole, he seemed to find another. Every time they clarified a rule, he discovered a new interpretation. What began as a series of technical disagreements eventually became something much larger. A contest over who understood the rulebook better. The officials writing it, or the mechanic reading it. His name was Smokey Yunick. Today, he's remembered as one of the most colorful characters in racing history. Stories about Smokey have become part of motorsports folklore. Some are well documented. Others have grown larger with every retelling. But behind all the legends was a very real accomplishment. Smokey helped expose weaknesses in NASCAR's early rulebook. He never won a championship as a driver. Yet few people had a greater influence on the way NASCAR evolved. Because Smokey wasn't trying to outspend the competition. He was trying to outthink it. And in the process, he became the man who forced NASCAR to rewrite the rules. Long before Smokey Yunick became a legend, he was building a reputation as one of the smartest mechanics in American racing. Born in Pennsylvania and later serving as a pilot during World War II, Yunick belonged to a generation of Americans who developed an instinctive understanding of machinery. The war had produced thousands of skilled mechanics, engineers, and pilots. When peace returned, many of them carried that technical knowledge into motorsports. After the war, he settled in Daytona Beach, Florida, where stock car racing was rapidly becoming one of the country's fastest-growing forms of competition. Smokey seized that opportunity. In 1947, he opened a workshop that would eventually become one of the most famous garages in racing history. He called it the best damn garage in town. The name sounded bold, the results backed it up. During NASCAR's formative years, Smokey's cars became some of the most competitive in the sport. Working with drivers such as Herb Thomas, he helped build machines capable of winning against the best teams in America. Over the course of his NASCAR career, cars prepared by Smokey Yunick would accumulate 57 Grand National victories and contribute to championship-winning seasons in 1951 and 1953. That kind of success demanded attention. At first, the attention came from competitors. Then, it came from manufacturers. Eventually, it came from NASCAR officials. Because whenever people examined Smokey's work closely, they noticed something unusual. He approached race cars differently than many of his contemporaries. Most mechanics focused on fixing problems. Smokey focused on understanding systems. If an engine failed, he wanted to know exactly why. If a competitor was faster, he wanted to understand every factor contributing to the advantage. That mindset made him successful. It also made him dangerous. Because while most teams were searching for speed under the hood, Smokey was beginning to search somewhere else. He was studying the rulebook.
They ever come around. There they are. Thomas and Reed running 1-2 at the finish.
Modern NASCAR teams operate under one of the most detailed rulebooks in professional sports. Body dimensions are measured to fractions of an inch. Templates verify aerodynamic surfaces. Engine, suspension, and fuel system regulations fill hundreds of pages. The NASCAR Smokey entered was very different. The rules were shorter, the inspections were simpler, and many technical decisions depended on interpretation. Inspectors carried measuring tapes and gauges. Cars were still relatively close to production vehicles. The assumption was simple. If a component looked legal, measured correctly, and complied with the written rules, it raced. For most competitors, That wasn't a problem. They viewed the rulebook the way most people view traffic laws, as a list of restrictions designed to define acceptable behavior. Smokey viewed it differently. When most mechanics saw a rule, they saw a boundary. Smokey saw an engineering problem. He wasn't interested only in what the rule prohibited, he wanted to know what the rule assumed. If NASCAR regulated fuel tanks, why only fuel tanks? If NASCAR measured wheelbase, what about everything connected to it? If NASCAR inspected components individually, what happened when the advantage came from the relationship between components? Those were questions most competitors never asked. Smokey asked them constantly, and that was the real problem. Because NASCAR's early rules were designed to stop yesterday's problems. Smokey was already looking for tomorrow. By the mid-1960s, inspecting one of Smokey Yunick's cars had become an event. Officials expected surprises, competitors expected arguments, and Smokey seemed perfectly comfortable with both. One area attracted particular attention: fuel. Because in NASCAR, fuel wasn't simply about making power, it was strategy. At Daytona, a typical Grand National car of the era often averaged somewhere between 4 and 5 miles per gallon during race conditions. On a 2.5-mile superspeedway, that meant every gallon represented roughly 2 laps of racing. 2 extra gallons could mean 4 additional laps. 4 laps might not sound important until a caution flag appears, or until a competitor is forced to pit first. Smokey understood that, which is why he wasn't focused exclusively on the fuel tank. He was focused on the entire fuel system. According to one of the most famous stories associated with him, Smokey noticed that NASCAR's regulations carefully specified fuel tank capacity while saying much less about the plumbing connected to it. The story claims he used a fuel line measuring roughly 2 inches in diameter and approximately 11 feet in length. If accurate, that line could theoretically hold more than 2 gallons of fuel on its own. Not enough to transform a race, but enough to influence one. And that distinction mattered, because Smokey rarely searched for dramatic advantages. He searched for small advantages that accumulated. 1 extra lap here, a few tenths of a second there, slightly improved efficiency somewhere else. Individually, they seemed insignificant. Together, they could win races. That's what made Smokey difficult to regulate. Most competitors focused on what the rules said. Smokey focused on what the rules assumed. NASCAR assumed limiting tank size controlled fuel capacity. Smokey asked a different question. What if the tank wasn't the only place fuel could exist? That way of thinking eventually produced one of the most famous legends in racing history. The story claims NASCAR inspectors removed the fuel tank from one of Smokey's cars and discovered the engine could still run. Whether every detail is true remains heavily debated, but the fact that people believed it tells us something important. By then, Smokey's reputation had become larger than any single incident. He had become the man who looked where nobody else was looking. And NASCAR was beginning to realize how difficult that mindset would be to control. The fuel system wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that Smokey approached race cars differently than almost everyone else in NASCAR. Most mechanics worked on parts. Smokey worked on relationships. A fuel tank mattered. But so did the line connected to it. A body panel mattered, but so did the airflow moving across it. An engine mattered, but so did the resistance it fought at 190 miles per hour. When NASCAR opened Daytona International Speedway in 1959, it immediately changed the engineering priorities of stock car racing. The track was 2.5 miles long. The banking reached 31 degrees. Cars spent enormous amounts of time at full throttle. By the mid to late 1960s, top NASCAR teams were regularly reaching speeds between 180 to 190 miles per hour on the straights. At those speeds, aerodynamic drag becomes a serious engineering problem. Drag doesn't increase in a straight line. It increases exponentially. A car traveling 190 miles per hour experiences dramatically more aerodynamic resistance than a car traveling 150 miles per hour. That means finding another 5 miles per hour isn't simply a matter of adding horsepower. Sometimes it's easier to reduce drag. Smokey understood that earlier than many competitors. NASCAR still promoted the idea of stock-bodied race cars, but engineers and mechanics had already learned that subtle body changes could influence airflow, a cleaner roofline, a smoother rear window transition, better airflow around the front of the car. Individually, these changes might only be worth fractions of a second per lap. But Daytona wasn't a quarter-mile drag strip. The Daytona 500 lasted 500 miles, 200 laps. A gain of only 1/10 of a second per lap could theoretically become 20 seconds over an entire race distance. 20 seconds was enormous. That could be the difference between winning and finishing several positions back. And aerodynamics was only one area. Weight distribution mattered too. A NASCAR stock car of the era weighed approximately 3,600 to 3,800 pounds. Moving even 50 pounds to a more advantageous location could influence handling, tire wear, and corner exit speed. Again, the game wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. That's the key to understanding Smokey. Not because he was breaking the rules, because he kept discovering assumptions hidden inside them. NASCAR kept writing rules for yesterday's problems. Smokey kept finding tomorrow. By the end of the 1960s, NASCAR faced a problem much larger than Smokey Yunick. The sport was no longer a regional attraction. It was becoming a national business. Corporate sponsorship was increasing. The money involved had changed dramatically. In NASCAR's earliest years, many teams operated out of small garages with limited resources. Success often depended on local talent, mechanical skill, and determination. By the late 1960s, that world was disappearing. Major manufacturers had entered the battle. Ford, Chrysler, General Motors. They had transformed stock car racing into a corporate battleground. Victory on Sunday translated into showroom traffic on Monday, and manufacturers were willing to spend heavily to achieve it. In 1960, the Daytona 500 purse was roughly $68,000. By 1970, it had climbed to more than $200,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $1.5 million in today's money. And that was just one race. Manufacturers weren't spending that kind of money for fun. They wanted victories. And victories justified increasingly sophisticated engineering programs. Nothing demonstrated this better than NASCAR's Aero Wars. The Dodge Charger Daytona, introduced in 1969, featured a nose cone nearly 18 inches long and a rear wing standing almost 2 feet above the trunk lid. The design looked absurd because it wasn't built for appearance. It was built for speed. The results were immediate. In March 1970, Buddy Baker became the first driver to officially exceed 200 miles per hour on a closed course in a Charger Daytona. The average speed was 200.447 miles per hour. For comparison, many NASCAR tracks only a decade earlier were seeing top speeds closer to 140 to 150 miles per hour. The sport had changed dramatically, and the faster the cars became, the more valuable technical advantages became. A loophole that might have been worth a few dollars in the 1950s could be worth a race victory by 1970. A race victory could influence manufacturer marketing campaigns. Manufacturer marketing campaigns involved millions of dollars. Suddenly, technical inspections weren't just about fairness. They were protecting the credibility of an increasingly valuable sport. That's why NASCAR's rulebook expanded so aggressively. Measurements that once relied on visual inspection became exact dimensions. Body shapes were checked with templates. Fuel systems received greater scrutiny. Suspension geometry became more tightly controlled. The sport was moving away from interpretation and moving toward measurement. In many ways, that transformation was NASCAR's response to competitors like Smokey Yunick. Because every time Smokey found a gray area, NASCAR discovered another place where precision was needed. Today, most racing fans know Smokey Yunick through stories: the fuel line controversy, the inspection battles, the legendary garage in Daytona Beach, the famous arguments with NASCAR officials. Those stories are entertaining, but they only explain part of his legacy. The deeper story is about innovation. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Smokey repeatedly exposed weaknesses in NASCAR's rulebook. Not because he ignored the rules, but because he understood them differently. Every loophole NASCAR closed led to another question. Every controversy revealed another gray area. And every gray area eventually became another paragraph in the rulebook. By the end of the decade, the sport was moving toward a new philosophy: more measurements, more precise inspections, more engineering. In many ways, that's the NASCAR we recognize today. And that's the irony of Smokey Yunick. For years, NASCAR tried to stop him, but modern racing eventually adopted the same mindset that made him so difficult to stop in the first place. And in the process, he helped shape the modern sport we know today.